The webinar is now live. And there's people starting to come in. Hello, everybody. If you are here for a webinar on social innovation, then this is the right spot. If this is not what you signed up for, this is your time to jump off. So welcome. We're going to get started in 2 minutes, but we'll let everybody come in and settle into to the Zoom beforehand. So while you're here and waiting for us to get going, what about dropping into the chat box where you're from, where you're joining us from, so that we know who's in the room. And then I always do like some shout outs too, if I know you, just because it's fun. Okay, so what do we got? Jonathan, he's here to monitor you, Steff, from Ottawa. We have Pauline, City of Airdrie, CMHC, Fredericton, Rob from Edmonton, Waterloo, Ontario, GP Youth Emergency Shelter. Hey, Tanya, we're gonna work together. Maple Ridge, BC. Oh my gosh, too quick. Martina, my old colleague from Calgary Homeless Foundation. Oh my goodness, this is happening too fast. Okay, what else can I see here? Kingston, Brampton, City of Beaumont, Crystal from Buffalo, welcome. Kelly, Treaty 6, Edmonton, Marlene from Airdrie, Mary Sebastian from Ottawa, Peel Region, Stephanie, awesome. Welcome everybody. Antoinette from Mississauga. What else do we got here? Okay, so if you're just joining us, then drop into the chat while everybody's coming on where you're joining us from. Ed from a 3D Printed Homes Corp in Calgary. Hello, I love that stuff. I want one.
So do we.
Yeah.
I know Ed.
Snunnemach and first the Coast Salish people, hello, welcome. We've done some work in the region, so nice to see you. Lynn from StatsCan, welcome. Monica from Thunder Bay, excellent. Thanks for dropping that in the text so that we know where everybody's coming from. Cheryl from City of Edmonton, Franco from VCC Calgary, hello Franco. Vancouver, UGM, awesome. Okay, we'll give this 1 more minute for everybody to come on and we'll get started. Okay, Calgary Food Bank, Kamal, awesome. Awesome. So this session is going to be recorded. We've had about 500 folks that have signed up for this session. So some of them are joining us live right now and some of them are going to be watching this at a different time. So be assured that we are recording and we will share this with you as well for having it handy if anybody has missed this session live. Marlene from Edmonton, there I'll do one more. Hythe, Alberta. I've never been there. I've never heard of it. Interesting. Okay, we get to learn lots about our country this way. There we go. So we'll get started with setting the context for today. And as folks come on, they can drop it into the chat where they're joining us from so that we all know. So welcome everybody. We have a jam-packed session so that we actually had to add time to because of the interest. So thank you for spending the morning with us on this, especially because it's Innovation Week across the world. So this is hopefully going to be content specific to that topic for the week. So we always begin with an acknowledgement of the land. I'm joining you from Treaty 7 in southern Alberta, Mohkinstsis, which is now known as Calgary. And I encourage you to all consider the land and give acknowledgement to the land that you're joining us from across the country. So thank you. And a little bit about what's in store for you today. So obviously the welcome, boom, check, that's done. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview and some of the insights that I've seen as a social tech company at HelpSeeker and what we're seeing in terms of innovation from that angle. So stay tuned for that piece. This where we play, and this is the space that we're really comfortable with. Then we're going to have Chief Dale McFee from Edmonton talk to you about what systems change the police force is undertaking and instigating in some ways in Edmonton as well, and what he's been up to. Then CMHC. So we have Steff Jones, who's the VP of Innovation at Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And I titled his subtitle, Why CMHC is Now More Than Just Mortgages, because some of you might know CMHC as that more traditional role in the ecosystem, but that's certainly changed significantly. So he's going to tell you more about that and what they're up to. And then we have Dr. Ian Cooper, who is joining us from Reaching Home, which is the federal government's focus on homelessness through an investment for communities to respond. And that is really interesting in the time of COVID. And he's going to focus on how agile communities have become in response to this crisis, and on some of the changes that have happened overnight in some ways that we've been wanting for a very, very long time. So lots and lots of innovation stuff, practical things, and big concepts that is coming your way. We're going to be using Menti. Again, for those of you who have joined us on webinars before, it's just a simple way. And since we're talking about tech and innovation, let's go a little bit out of our comfort zones to make sure that we are getting your feedback. So we're going to be directing you to a quick site. You can do it on your phone, and you kind of give us your audience feedback at certain points. So stay tuned. I'll tell you what to do when that time happens as well. All right, and it looks like we are almost at 200 folks, so means we can get the party started. So I introed these guys already, but if you want to see like that they're legit, this is their titles and these are their pictures. So thank you to my team who made this slide as well. Made us look good. So social tech and putting Canada on the map. So this is going to be my piece of the content. And before I hand it off to the speakers, just to set some context on what's happening across the country from our standpoint. If you don't know HelpSeeker and what we're about and why we're talking about social innovation, we're a B Corp technology company that focuses on digital solutions for social issues. So we build solutions for help seekers, so people that are looking for help and needing to connect with help. We build solutions for service providers. So how do they become more effective and digitized in some ways? Our sector is very much not exactly the top of the list when it comes to tech innovation, but we think we can definitely get us there. And then decision makers, so folks that are making those funding and policy recommendations or decisions, how do they know that those decisions are evidence-based or evidence-led and have the data to back up some of their assumptions? So we build solutions for these three groups. Our national partners are CMHC and the Canadian Digital Tech Supercluster. And you'll see from Steff's talk what we're up to there. But we always want to acknowledge these two crews because they're a really big reason for why we were able to scale so quickly. Awesome, thanks for that. And then we're going to move to a little bit about social tech innovation and give you some sense of what's happening that's relevant to the social sector when it comes to technology as well. And if you're wondering why we should care about tech, and tech innovation when we think about social challenges, well, I mean, look around and what's happening in the tech space overall. All of our aspects of life have been impacted by technology, so we're not going to see that disappear by any means. It's going to ramp up significantly moving forward. And in the tech world, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, and I'm not sure how common that is used in the social sector, but what 4IR refers to is the 4IR, fourth industrial revolution. And that term is referring to the advent of some of these new technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence, and how that's changing how we work, how we live, how we play, how we interact with one another. And those are all impacting those that we serve as service providers, and therefore we're going to be impacted by this whether we want to or not. So we have this dream that we can use that technology for social good. And to do that, we need to be intentional about it. We need to engage in those hard conversations around the ethics of AI, for example, or rather than borrowing technology from private industry that is completely different than the social sector, we need to build our own solutions and control those solutions in a way that's ethical and equitable as well. So those are the pieces that are driving our mission and what we develop at HelpSeeker. But these are bigger trends that we all need to be aware of and monitor and get engaged in and get knowledgeable about, because these are things that are going to impact social issues moving forward. In the past industrial revolutions, we've had technologies drive some of these social changes that we're still living with in some way. So if you kind of go back to the Dickens times and the previous urbanization and industrialization ages, that's some of the advent of the mass poverty and mass homelessness and displacements that we saw, back in those times. But in some ways, we're still inheriting some of those implications today. So wouldn't it make sense to get on top of this and get engaged in this revolution so that we're not picking up the pieces on the back end as a sector? So with that being said, my presentation to you is about some of the technology trends that I think are important for you as social sector leaders to be aware of, because these are the things that are kind of be disrupting the way that you work. And disrupting is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's a really, really welcome thing as well. So there's goods and there's bad to all of these as well, just a note. So, and I'll go through them and speak about why I picked these to highlight. So digital identity, and this is one that some of you may or not may be aware of, but it's just this idea that rather than having your multiple identity cards, for instance, you would have a fully secure and encrypted digital identity that would move us from this fragmented information to increase that privacy and control over your personal digital data online. So it's already in use in government services, not necessarily on the social side, interestingly, but definitely on the radar for governments. Alberta, for instance, has a My Alberta digital identity. So that product is already being used. I can go in and see what my taxes are. I can go see what my health records are, etc. So I can connect my identity with various interactions I have with public systems. So the reason this is really interesting, of course, for the social sector, is that it brings a whole new game to the concept of client rights and clients' control over their personal information. It also changes the game when it comes to the client having to tell their story over and over again, because now they have this passport to services and they're in control of what parts of their record they share and when. So that's going to be certainly something coming our way at the sector level, and think of all the implications of that and what we need to do to get ready for that expectation. So if this is where the world is going to with digital identity, this is going to become an expectation of all of us in the social sector. How are we going to be able to absorb that into our workflows? Next one is AI and predicting social issues. So this is another one that might seem far-fetched, but it's actually here. So there's obviously the projects that we've been up to, so I can speak to those, but this is not unique to what HelpSeeker is doing. There's lots of work being done across the world on using machine learning to get ahead of trends. So happens all the time in the financial world. It happens all the time in the medical world. Well, it's here too when it comes to social challenges as well. So even for us being able to apply machine learning to say, hey, can we predict what the homeless count is going to be this year? And that's one of the projects we're doing with the 7 cities in Alberta, because they weren't able to do a street count this year. We're now saying, well, interesting, let's look at the facility count and let's look at the algorithm and say, what did the algorithm say the count should be, and start playing with some of the scenarios to understand what that gap is. So those are things that are in practice today, which means they're going to ramp up even faster at rates that we and applications that we haven't even conceived of. But that's going to really disrupt, I think, the way we think about social policy right now. And I think it's also going to challenge some of the concepts that we have around what root causes might be. Because the way machine learning works, it takes in all of this data that we've never had enough humans on a research project to process. And we're going to be able to say, hey, I thought this was a big driver of food insecurity or domestic violence, and it turns out it's not. So because in relation to all this huge data set and thousands and millions of connections between the data, maybe some of those assumptions are not going to stand true. And we've certainly seen that in our work on suicide, domestic violence, and homelessness, but we're expecting that's going to be the case longer term as well. The next one is this digital social service experience and wanting to move us from this concept of paper to this concept of digital. So how much of our lives, and skip the dishes is my go-to example, in COVID, we were all skip the dishes and Uber Eats fanatics. People are expecting that type of experience with accessing social services as well. Doesn't mean the whole thing is now digitized, but the experience has to be streamlined and become much more user-friendly as well. Everybody's gone digital. Everybody's expecting things to be digital. We need to get out of that as well. The next one is the complexity of burdensome reporting and just database customization happening all the time. So lots of your record management that's happening right now locally. So, we use the cloud somewhat. There's so much happening and so much innovation and so many low-cost solutions now to streamline that reporting work for end users, so those that are nonprofits or funders as well, so that you get the insights rather than the data collection. And on the last one as well, I call it the old school 100-page reports that were my bread and butter as a consultant, the $100,000 per year and very, very little insights, but good money for consulting, but not really that useful longer term. Moving away from that and digitizing insights and recommendations using technology. So some of the pieces that we're doing in this space, and you guys will know this as well, that the Community Success Hub, so the next phase of HelpSeeker's work, we've obviously got the pieces that are happening for the end users, so people looking for help, the apps, and that we're known for. We've also ramped up this digital transformation around the decision-making for policy and funders. So folks that are looking into trends in a particular community and want to compare that to other communities or layer data sets to look at insights, that's some of the stuff that we're really excited about. So this is just a little overview of that. And so some of the things that are in our pipeline, for instance, is looking at housing and homelessness specifically. So drawing in all the various data sets that are out there, layering them on top of each other and generating solutions or suggested solution based on best practices or lived experience input. Getting ahead of these trends by saying, well, this is what's happening today. Here's what's likely to happen in the future in your community. Here's how you compare to other communities with similar populations in your jurisdiction. And doing that in an automated fashion so that you're not waiting a year. The data's old. We got to move on. The layering of real-time data as well as some of the more old school data sets that we are all used to using, like Statistics Canada, which are still really important, but not the only source of data. One of the pieces that we're introducing as well, and I'm not going to take this away from Dale because he's going to talk to you about it, but automating social impact audits. So understanding all of the funding in a particular ecosystem so that funders have a full understanding of who's doing what and who's funding what, and layering that on top of a systems map to know what gaps are. That's a big push for us in our development work, because again, it's one thing for Dale to know, it's another one for everybody to know and have that be transparent and democratized. So that kind of concludes my piece, and I'll end with a quick plug for those of you that are Community Success Hub members. The June course, we figured out our June course curriculum. So if you're somebody that's looking at funding integration in your community, and you're, July 7, I messed that up. July 7 from 9 to noon EST. So if you're looking at creating a more streamlined approach to funding in your community, if you're looking at understanding kind of those common investment priorities across funders, and you want to get in on some of the knowledge from some of us that have been there, done that before, we're doing this course. Like I said, for 3 hours. It won't be as boring as just me talking. We're going to do lots of hands-on things and give you some hands-on tools on how to understand the funding ecosystem in your community, some of the best practices around investment priority setting, coordinated procurement, co-investment due diligence, and outcomes-based contracting, and then using some of this new data that we have to connect to your funding decisions. So if you are interested in that, I think Jenny's the contact there. And I think we're looking at about 30 spots for that, just because it's just going to be myself and Marty doing it. So we want to make sure we have the one-on-one time with you. So we'll do a bit of a first come, first serve. Awesome. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chief McFee, and he's going to take you through his presentation, and we'll see you after that. Thanks.
Thanks, Alina, and thanks everybody for joining us, and special thanks, Alina, to you for setting it up, and Stephanie, and it's just good to be able to talk at this from many different angles. So as Alina stated, we're in a unique opportunity in the world right now. Obviously, data and technology is evolving quickly. COVID has expedited that, which is leaving us with a lot of opportunities. And I think if you're looking in the mirror and you're wondering things are different, I would just caution everybody to embrace it. I mean, this is probably the single biggest opportunity that we've ever had, to drive some much needed change in the social safety net. We all have those opportunities over the course of our career. There's those aha moments. Certainly for me, it was probably 5, 6, maybe even 7 years ago in some of my previous life as a deputy minister. One was speaking at the OECD conference in Paris, and the other one was at a social finance conference in Chicago, where they had 54 countries. 54 countries and a bunch of obviously philanthropy. You know, it's the Gates, the MacArthur Foundations, the big ones. I was there with the McConnell Foundation too. 54 countries and about $500 billion in the room, and we couldn't solve the problems in the social side of the house. So it tells you that it's not a money issue. It's basically needs some breaking. If it's not broke, break it, and we actually need to look at it differently. So that's what I'm going to kind of talk to you about today. But before I talk about that, I'll give you a little bit of an analogy that I always used to back in the days in business when I used to own A&Ws, is you don't mess with the team burger, the onion rings, or the root beer, but everything else you can have a look at. And certainly those of you in the Western Canada would understand that. So data and technology, as a good friend of mine, Sheldon Kennedy, would say, to know better is to do better. So if we could just change the slide there, Alina. We did an audit of the social safety net just exclusively for Edmonton. This kind of comes from Alina and I putting two heads together, trying to make 1 + 1 = 3. My old job of knowing where to find money, her job of knowing how to actually dig into mine, all this stuff. This actually started to tell us about the story. Now, everybody thinks this is coming to defund the police movement, and part of it did, but this was something for us. We started a thing called Vision 2020 in 2019, pre-COVID, pre-George Floyd, to actually start to look at this, and that opportunity actually expedited this. And when we actually started to dig into this, what you really saw is we have a whole lot of money in the system, and everybody will say, well, what's that? Like, as police, we're not interested in who doesn't belong and who does belong. It's about how to use our voice of influence versus our voice of authority. Because if we're going to make communities safer and well-being, we're going to need our partners. But we're going to need the strategic partnerships that we can get underneath them with our data. They can partner with us, and we can fail, and we can succeed together. What it really boils down to is prioritization and focus, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But as much as it is to solve problems, half the problem is we sometimes don't get the question right. What is it that we're actually trying to solve? Which jumps to new programs, a bunch of different things, more disjointed, more funding problems. We fund all these things, and at the end of the day, we've got a whole lot of things going in a whole lot of directions, and it's kind of like playing a game of Risk. You know, if we all probably are familiar with playing a game of Risk, we all know that if you put an army on every country, all that you really are is first out of the game. Time to get our armies aligned, actually fight to make a prioritized focus, and maybe we get 20% out of the system, and then we focus on the 10%. So that was our focus on the 7.5 billion. If you flip again, Alina. This is an interesting piece. So what of that 7.5 billion, there's 1.1 billion that, you know, go to those things that we've all heard about: homelessness, poverty, addiction, mental health. Those things disproportionately drive police for calls for service. In a $7.5 billion ecosystem, we're a $462 million budget. Let me just be very clear: in all the roles that I've held, and whether it's policing and government, had the senior transformational change file for government, moving money around has never worked. And moving money around is never going to work. At a crisis, you go to 911, we dumped a bunch of money into policing. If you get something that happens in social services, you dump a bunch of money in social services. The reality is we've never actually looked at the structures. We've never looked at the structures to say, are we structured for success? And this is what I really want to talk about today. So this isn't to point fingers, because we got a lot of good organizations in the city of Edmonton working 100% flat out. But what this is trying to do is, how do we actually coordinate it so we're actually going in the same direction? So if you look at that chart, that tells you where that 1.1 billion is spent. Alina can get into it just as in a dashboard in service elements. But when you actually look at that, relieving poverty is where the bulk of the money is spent. So that's your shelters. That's the various different things, coordinating, connecting activity. When you actually look at that, there's no minimum standards in those. There's no minimum requirements. There's no things that need to be met in relation to that. So again, there's an opportunity. That's not saying because it's that way, it's anybody's fault. It just highlights an opportunity. But when you actually go down that list and you look and you go down, addiction recovery programs and center. Well, we've already said that addictions, particularly in Edmonton, meth is a huge problem, as it is in most parts of Canada, huge problem, and it's growing exponentially. The funding starts to dwindle. Then we go into youth programs and services, and we talk about breaking the cycle. It goes down. Lynn at StatsCan, who we've worked with, would tell you that single mothers, battered women's are an area where we should be focusing. Guess what? It drops down yet again. Rehabilitation of offenders. Again, when I co-chaired StatsCan with Lynn on the CCGS side of it, it tells you that there's a certain amount of reoffending is done with your serious violent offenders. And those people, that's where limited funding goes. And then if you go down even further and you start look at Aboriginal programs and services, yet we say that's the most overrepresented group. So just by looking at this, I think we probably could put people in a room and put heads together and say, how do we prioritize and focus to get the question right to meet the need? Those are the things that I've been fortunate to look at and study for quite some time, number of years. I honestly think the future where we're going in relation to policing and is law enforcement, public health. Public health has the ability to engineer. Law enforcement has the ability to reverse engineer. If we can actually get that structure right, we probably could actually start to differentiate between the front end services and the back end, or the upstream and the downstream. But really what we do, and this came from with me, there was a lady at the OPIC that spoke of this at the social finance conference. And basically, she said it like this: we do all this innovative work for government, and we did all this, and then they come and they tell us, but yeah, we got to fit this into a ministry, or we got to fit this into this bucket to make it fit, rather than actually look at the structure to see if the structure actually is causing some of the problems. You know, somebody asked me in a media interview probably about 6-8 months ago, Chief, if you're king for a day, what would you do? I said, I'd probably take police out of the justice system, and I'd take public health out of the health system, and I'd put them in the same ministry with the not-for-profits. There's two things that drive policing. There's the social issues that drive calls for service, and there's the serious offenders that actually drive crime. Those are not the same bucket. But where they become the same bucket, if you put these people in jail with these people, you mix low risk and high risk, they all become high risk. So actually, you can artificially increase your crime rate. I didn't learn that till I actually was in charge of corrections, and we reverse engineered corrections, life cycle of the offender. What it came up with, we were looking at our overtime budget, and somebody said, you know, Chief, I think if you actually let 11% of people out of jail, you might be able to reduce your crime by 4 or 5%. And I look at him, I go, what? But the key is you got to let the right people out. You got to jail the people you're afraid of and not the ones you're mad at. And this is the whole thing. Police control 100% of the justice system on the entry. There's only two things that really matter. It's reducing intake, and that's for all human services, and making sure every off-ramp works. What's an off-ramp? Income assistance, child welfare, bail remand, mental health, addictions, housing, homelessness. All we right now measure for the most part is what we put into the system. We're not measuring success by what we get out. That's where we get into some of the outcomes piece that Alina's talking. If you want to switch the slide, Alina. So when we actually start to look at this differently, we're starting to look at it many different ways. So we at the Edmonton Police Service, that's run by our Edmonton Police Foundation with partners, we have a community solutions accelerator. That's to use innovation to drive what it is to get the question right, to actually how do you get underneath the community to drive a change? What are some examples that we've done in there? One of the examples is liquor store thefts and robberies. We had 9,600 of them last year. We had to do something with them. So what did we actually do? Well, there's the one thing that we always try to do is catch the person that does the liquor store theft or robbery that disrupts and victimizes people, put them in the criminal justice system, and then, you know, hopefully the criminal justice system is going to fix them. You know, the aha moment for me is when we charged one individual with 35 of them, and they got out the next day with one condition. And I think we all could predict the condition. Well, that was to not go to the liquor store. Well, that I called the judge because I knew the judge, and I said, did you not think that we might have thought of that? There's the difference. So how do we take that market away? So then we put a challenge out to the world. We get 500 submissions from across the world and basically say, let's take it away. So then what came up with, there was two things that drive: the vulnerable stealing to support their habit, which is the minor, and the organized component, which the gangs, et cetera, that treat it as a commodity, and they were stealing serious quantities and a lot of robberies in that space. So we get it out, the community 500, we get all these submissions. At the end of the day, it comes into three streams. Scanner IDs, obviously at the entrances. It comes into a marketing campaign to actually and to do it. And McEwen University was the one that won it. And then it came into a GPS tracking device and some of the bottles to actually track the organized component. The ones that have all of those in them right now, 95% reduction in those stores. The ones that only have part of them, 40%. Overall, we've dropped that by 40%. As a result, we're starting to come up with some of our best crime stats that we've ever had. Not by solving it, but by taking the opportunity away. And then the other piece to that, we've built a whole community safety and well-being bureau to reference, to get the people that are doing it to support their habit connected to services. And so that's how we're starting to change. And we've reinvested $28 million of our budget upstream to partner with the right partners to drive it, because that's what drives our calls for service. Again, don't mix them with crime, because they're different and everybody wants to jump them on together. And that's where we get all this confusion. So the keys to difference here, just a couple more other accelerator examples. We're doing a mental health app to get actually with TELUS and Esprit real time, because I mean, with COVID, the mental health and certainly with George Floyd, the mental health component of a frontline policing has went off the charts, and we need better services. We're doing a project with Boyle Street in one of our not-for-profits with Motorola to actually start to look at what it is they actually need to get out of the environment. And what we're learning from that particular thing is a lot of it isn't housing. It's a lot of other services. Not to say housing is important, but again, it's to try to get the right things to the right people at the right time to actually create, rather than dependence, how do you create independence to get them out of the stream and out of the cycle? So if you look at that, and we'll flip the next slide, because I think I'm almost done my time here. Really, these are some of the things that shouldn't be as hard to do as we think it is. And this is why we called the 7.5 billion, and we asked the provincial government to look at this. Why did we ask the provincial government? Because they're the largest funder. 60% of that 7.5 billion comes from government. Most of it comes from the provincial government, but certainly the federal government and the municipal government play a part in that. But then the other part of that is 35% of that also comes from philanthropy, business, etc., which are just sometimes willfully blind funding things without outcomes. So if we can get integrated funding, set the outcomes, do co-design, co-measurement, co-evaluation up front, we should be able to get 20% of the system by getting the right people in the room. And that, don't think that's changing everything. This is a huge problem, but we're trying to fix the whole problem rather than chunk it out, kind of like eating an elephant one bite at a time. The second thing, performance management. How do you actually, there's a lot of talk now about funding outcomes. There's some good social stuff coming out of that. There's various leaders in that. Sean Loney, who I've got to know out of Manitoba, does some great work on that, but there's others. Again, but really what that really means is we got to measure together, and we got to measure against and with each other at the same time. And this whole data transparency and availability and innovation that lies, we've never had this before. That's the difference. That's the difference maker. If you think back 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and when we were trying to fix these complex problems, and we were all pulling our hair out, as you can see, I lost mine. But when we actually did that, when you think about that, we didn't have the opportunity, things like Alina has and others, and we have as a police service, to actually look at this in a more fulsome manner. We've never leveraged that. Think about it, if you're in rural Canada somewhere and you're driving down a gravel road and it's dark out, and you had the opportunity just to continue driving, or would you turn the lights on? What would you do? That's really what data gives us the ability to do, is turn the lights on, shine some light on this stuff, and to actually work in ways that we never done before. So I think this is probably the single biggest opportunity. We've got something that we submitted to our government here to expand our community solutions accelerator with a Silicon Valley tech partner. This space needs rapid innovation, and innovation that actually puts the client in the middle of it and actually focuses on getting the results rather than just providing programs, because that's where I think the rubber hits the road and we have the best opportunities. But I will leave it at that and turn it back to you, Alina. Thank you for your time.
Wow, that was great and so prompt and on time. That's awesome.
Not
Thanks.
very often that happens, and you know that.
No, it's like perfect, like wow, perfectly timed. So thank you, Chief McFee. And I'm always learning something else from listening to you, like a different angle on my thinking too. So thank you. I'm now going to move us to this first Menti question. And just a heads up that Steff's next. So while Steff is getting himself ready to go, I'm going to tell you guys how this Menti component works, and then we can try that out. So just a second, I'm going to share this new screen. So what you got to do is go to, if you see up here, menti.com. So if you go to menti.com on your phone or on your device, like whatever device you have, and there's going to be this question that shows up there. If you want to go in there and just give us your answer, and let's see what the kind of audience thinks. Let's start with the first question. What kind of training opportunities would help you with social innovation? So thinking about what you heard thus far, we hear about capacity in the sector being a major challenge. So yeah, let's see what you guys think. And I got 2 questions on Menti, and then we're going to turn it over to our next presenter. So yeah, you go to menti.com and then you plug in that code. So it's 5362. Let's see how good we are with technology. 89. Okay, and then you type in your thoughts. Yeah, creative data collection. Yeah. What else? Okay, what else do we have? Okay, data integration, SROI, open data, visualization of data, capacity. Okay, interesting. Let's see what else. Collaboration, government collaboration. Yeah, we definitely need that for to get the data out as well. Data visualization, trying courses, what type of data we need. Okay. Awesome. Data visualization, how to work with big data. Yeah. Interesting. So it looks like collaboration seems to be the one that's coming out. And then the visualization and data interpretation, that seems to be another theme. Once we get the data, what do we do with the data, basically? Awesome. Okay. Well, let's see what our next question is. Okay. 10 more seconds until this one closes. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Awesome. So voting closed. Okay, and then the last one before we hand it over to Steff, how else can data support social innovation? Same thing, you can just plug in your answers. So thinking about your work and what you've heard thus far. See patterns, communicate, highlight gaps, best practices, so identifying best practices using evidence, the true root causes, yeah, connecting people, myth busting, yeah, measuring outcomes, highlighting gaps, SROI, better decision making. You can see lots of gaps and outcomes patterns. Okay. Very good. All right. Let's give this a 10-second countdown. Now that I can see you guys are getting the hang of it. There we go. Okay, so seeing patterns, funding, understanding funding, I'm assuming, understanding accountabilities and root causes. Very good. Excellent. Well, with that, let's see what another super disruptor, social innovator Steff has to share. And keeping all that in mind, think about the questions that you're going to be asking all of us at the end of this. So I'll hand it over to you, Steff.
Thanks, Alina. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And thanks, Alina and team, for putting this together. And Dale, tough act to follow. I don't know what's going on with the leadership in Edmonton, but it certainly is one of the more progressive municipalities. I see it, I heard it today, and I see it in the housing space. So whatever's happening there, kudos. And I hope it's, for me anyway, I think it sets a model or a standard for how other municipalities should be thinking about some of these things. So great to hear what's happening in Edmonton. Before I launch into what I have to say, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Ottawa, on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And during these difficult times, I've never been so grateful for the land that I am on. And so I hope you all take a moment to reflect and be grateful for the land you are joining us from today. I'm thrilled to be sharing the virtual stage with Alina, Dale, and Ian today. Although I will have to say, Alina, and this will be a bit of a shot, it's not lost on me that at least 3 of us are 3 white men. And I really hope that as we think about these things going forward, that we can continue to seek greater diversity in these conversations, because I think that's one of the things that is ailing us in these conversations. So just wanted to call that out. I do hope we have enough interesting things to say that perhaps it allows us to overlook it this time. But yeah, I really do think that's something we need to reflect on. That said, I love the description of today's panel and a promise that we won't necessarily be talking about more studies or research. I think that promise reflects a sense of frustration that many of us feel. You know, the social issues that challenge us these days, including housing, have had, you know, great amounts of research done already. And I think there's an urgency to get some things done. As we've seen in the last year in the context of housing, while I don't think anyone foresaw, well, I think most of us foresaw perhaps some weakness in the housing sector during a pandemic, but in fact, the complete opposite happened. And housing has never been more unaffordable than it is currently. And so I think the urgency to deal with that is just growing every day. Don't get me wrong, research is vital. We need data to inform our solutions and our policies and programs, et cetera. We just talked about data. We need to take the time to hear many voices, especially those that are most affected by our decisions. But we also need to think about changing our mindset about research. It is about being willing to try new things, learn from experience, and adjust and iterate as we go. I do find sometimes we get stuck a little bit in the analysis paralysis stage, and I think this sort of call to action is really important. And I think what was behind sort of our involvement with HelpSeeker, which I'll talk about in a little bit. You want to change the slide, Alina? There are, as I just mentioned, there are few issues that need more urgent action right now than housing affordability. There are some 1.7 million households in this country that are in core housing need, meaning they have to spend more than 30% of their income on shelter. And the current pandemic has only highlighted the sense of urgency and the need for innovation in this space. COVID-19 has touched all of our lives, but as with most crises, those in the most vulnerable situations have been hit the hardest. Low-income seniors and families, people with disabilities, veterans, Indigenous peoples, newcomers, people experiencing homelessness, women and children fleeing domestic violence, young adults, racialized communities, the list goes on. I think there's ample data that suggests that during these kinds of crises, these are the groups that suffer the most. Over the past 14 months, our homes have become a sanctuary. I feel uber privileged to have the home I have. It's a safe refuge where we now work, study, shop, almost everything else. But it's hard to stay at home. You know, there's been shelter in place orders all the way through the pandemic. It is hard, impossible to do that if you don't have a safe place to call home. Housing affordability seems to be more elusive than ever, even for middle income families. We talk about this concept of workforce housing. You know, the teachers and nurses and police and firemen and, you know, all these sort of essential services, it's getting harder and harder and harder for them to live in the communities within which they work. And in the end, you know, might have to commute up to 2 hours, and that has other costs, both social as well as, you know, actual hard costs in terms of infrastructure and pollution, et cetera. And it seems to be spreading to smaller cities and rural areas that used to be affordable. It's not just a big city phenomenon anymore. And Dale talked about aha moments. I had mine a couple of years ago, and I'm not necessarily proud to say, I've been at CMHC for 23 years. I've always loved our mandate. Clearly I've stayed. It's resonated with me throughout my career. But I'm from Peterborough, Ontario, which is a small town about an hour north of Toronto. And back in 2019, just pre-pandemic, I was back visiting family and friends. And I saw a tent encampment that had formed in the downtown park. And that was my own aha moment, you know, 21 years into my career at CMHC, where it suddenly struck me the realness of this problem. And if this can emerge in a small, you know, family-friendly town like Peterborough, where I grew up and have such great memories, and I see an encampment there, and how that encampment is being treated, it just resonated to me just that much more about why what CMHC does is important, why housing is important, and how this role of social innovation is critical to making a difference. As Canada's National Housing Agency, as I just said, this has made CMHC's work more pertinent than ever. And for me and everyone in the company, it has strengthened our resolve to this really ambitious goal we've set for ourselves, that by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford and that meets their needs. you know, some people laugh when they hear that goal, because it is audacious for sure. But if that isn't the goal of the National Housing Agency, then I'm really not sure what is. And by creating a time bound around it, again, it's sort of created a sense of urgency and, you know, rallying call within the company that I haven't seen in my entire career there. So as audacious as it is, I do think it creates the right mindset for tackling the kind of you know, huge housing problems that we have facing us. At CMHC, we've mobilized our entire company behind this goal. We built strong momentum through a major federal strategy that we're leading called the National Housing Strategy. This is a 10-year plan. It's evolved over time and is now $70+ billion worth of investment, including $2.5 billion in new investments just announced in the most recent federal budget. It includes a number of programs to encourage the building of more housing, because we know more supply leads to more affordability. One of these programs is called the Innovation Fund. It specifically supports building projects that are new building design or funding models. This program has been very successful. The first round, I believe, had $200 million, and a number of interesting initiatives came out of that. And it benefited from a commitment of additional funding in the latest federal budget, an additional $600 million over the next 7 years. These photos are from a project that uses an innovative funding model between Concordia's student union and a nonprofit developer to create student housing in Montreal. It's a model that could be replicated in other university towns across the country. And it's especially interesting in light of COVID and what we've learned about the spread of the virus in congregate settings like residences. This is an example of moving away from research to actually in-market testing and proving out concepts and finding new ways to house people. Alina, if you want to flick to the next slide. There we go. Another national housing strategy program focuses more, I'm going to use the word researching innovation, but I guarantee these aren't studies that will sit on a shelf. For example, we're funding a solution lab that brings together diverse groups to quickly develop potential solutions to today's biggest housing challenges. For example, to meet climate change goals, much of Canada's older affordable housing stock needs energy retrofits. It is one of the single biggest consumers guilty parties of greenhouse gas emissions. But how do we do this without displacing tenants? Well, this solution lab, working with residents and builders and industry and tenant advocacy partners, are developing guidelines, resources, and training to help others doing this work. There are models, so this is demonstrating a model to retrofit affordable housing while tenants remain in place to improve and contribute to Canada's climate targets. So not only are we exploring new solutions in market, we're also demonstrating initiatives that help to share new ideas and solutions. We often hear about homelessness and affordable housing in urban centers, but it's also an issue, albeit more hidden, in rural communities. The problem is that small communities may not have the capacity to assess the extent homelessness exists in their communities, making the business case for more affordable housing or figure out the best financial model that will work for them hard to find. With our support, the Rural Development Network has developed a step-by-step guide to help communities, smaller ones and those in rural settings, do just that. Again, you know, I talked about the National Housing Strategy and these contributions. Certainly, the government has a significant role to play in solving housing affordability challenges, but I'm a big proponent that the answer to this audacious goal that we've set for ourselves lies squarely outside the four proverbial walls of CMHC. There is an enormous amount of capacity, both capital, it's not a money problem, as Chief Dale said, as well as just willingness and intention to solve housing in the market. And I think it's critical that we find ways to tap into that capacity and all work towards collectively solving the housing affordability challenge that this country and many others are experiencing. Another really great example of an opportunity to do this is something we call the Housing Supply Challenge. This is actually a relatively new program introduced in the last 6 months or so. This is actually a series of challenges that were designed to incent the market to find new ways to break down barriers to housing supply. This is important because housing supply hasn't kept up with demand over the past decades, and this is a big reason for our affordability problems. The first challenge we launched late last year, and actually just closed in February of this year, was anchored in closing data gaps. And what we do is, so this is a 5-year government program. We have $300 million. We're creating a series of challenges that we put out to market, where we do an open call for proposals who can solve these housing supply barrier challenges. And the first one was anchored in data, as I mentioned, and it was a huge success. We had 136 proposals. We had an independent jury assess those. We landed on 21 shortlisted proponents. Those each received $200,000 in seed funding to take their idea to the next level. And they will then bring back their solutions for another round of evaluation in the fall, at which point they will share in $20 million in implementation money. So again, using government incentives and money to tap into that private market capacity to find ways to scale and generate solutions that can ultimately impact housing affordability in this country. We have another challenge. Actually, we did a pre-launch yesterday. It actually opens in early June. This one is called Getting Started. It focuses on reducing barriers during the early stages of housing development, from the initial idea to the beginning of construction. So things like zoning regulations, those processes, all the red tape that happens before a shovel goes in the ground, things like land acquisition, seed funding, design, architecture, all that kind of stuff. There are enormous barriers to housing supply at the sort of the pre-construction stage. And so this next round is targeted at that phase of the development. And it has, while the first round had 20 million in prize money or incentive available, this one has $40 million available. So again, using government funding to really tap into and leverage the enormous private sector capacity there is to solve housing affordability challenges. I'm going to speak a little bit about engineering collisions. The projects I've mentioned so far were all made possible through the National Housing Strategy. Like I said earlier, the strategy gives momentum to our goal of affordability, but it's not enough. Frankly, it's a drop in the bucket of what it's going to take to solve housing affordability challenges. Housing challenges are too big to be solved by government alone, particularly now in light of the significant federal deficit that has emerged as a result of providing the much needed supports to help us navigate the pandemic. We need to do more. We need to get more people involved. And as I said earlier, I believe that the answers to this lies outside CMHC. Our role and the role of the innovation team and sort of my role as the head of that is really to bring other often unexpected partners together to push the needle on affordability. I like to think that we're engineering collisions in the housing system, collisions between private developers, non-profit housing providers, governments, philanthropists, social entrepreneurs, and really anyone who has something they can bring to the table. This brings us to HelpSeeker. Alina and I met, late 2009. Oh God, the pandemic's getting my timelines all messed up. I think pre-pandemic, we met in just before, actually, February of 2020. We met in Calgary, and we started to work together. And I actually think there's an example of a fortuitous collision that has led to a wonderful, marvelous partnership. As soon as I met Alina and Travis, I knew they were onto something different and unique. You have to think about the what, but you also have to think about the who. And again, the passion and commitment they demonstrated to solving social problems that touch housing, I was just enamored with immediately and knew we had to find a way to work together. As many of you know, Alina has experienced living in precarious housing situations herself. She knew firsthand the impact of this on her and her family's well-being. With Solution Lab funding, HelpSeeker brought together innovative thinkers from across Medicine Hat's social services to build an app that matches Canadians in need with supports in their local community. As a result, someone at risk of homelessness can search their local area and find supportive housing just by using their phone. This has led to an even broader investment in HelpSeeker. We've now invested $2.5 million over the next 3 years to help scale HelpSeeker solution across the country. This idea of digitizing the social safety net, and you know, we just talked about data, and the implications for that, I think, are enormous. And you know, housing is not just about bricks and mortar. Yes, supplies is important, and delivering new units. And you know, even at CMHC, right, we have these internal debates. We talk about committed units. Well, the last I heard, you can't live in a committed unit. You can actually live in a home. And so we need to make sure those homes get built and that people have the supports they need to have access to those homes. And this is where I think HelpSeeker is such a critical part of the solution, and why, even though some people might think it's outside the mandate of CMHC, because it enables people to be housed and to move out of homelessness or prevent becoming homeless, I think it is absolutely at the center of our strategy and our 2030 goal. And hopefully our investment speaks volumes about that. It was a first for us to do this, but I think it sets the stage for how we can work with the private sector in much different ways. Another example is a company you won't have heard of yet because we haven't necessarily broadcast it. A company called Sparrow Living. It's a home sharing company that has been started with seed money from CMHC and our technology partner Accenture. We've each invested $500,000 to create basically an independent startup. And the plan for this agency is to unlock some of the 12 million plus empty bedrooms in this country. Tapping into only 1% of these has the potential to create over 100,000 new housing opportunities for people looking for another affordable housing solution. Again, the pandemic has thrown a bit of a curveball into that when you think about sort of space, but I believe we are social creatures at heart. You know, we're exploring our first use case, are seniors who perhaps are overhoused, who would like to age in place, stay out of long-term care facilities, and we've seen what's happened there during the pandemic, but perhaps need some companionship and some support around the house. So how do you pair them with perhaps a student who is looking for an affordable place to live where they can provide that companionship and support? It feels like a win-win. It creates connection and inclusivity, provides another affordable housing solution to those in need. And again, I just think is a really great example of us willing to try things differently to see if we can't develop more affordable housing in this country. It's funny, Alina talked about Ed McNabb earlier. The other thing we're actually pursuing this year that I think is a little bit outside the norm is we are working hard to bring Canada's first 3D house prototype to life. A prototype could lead to more questions than answers in this case, but that's how innovation should work. If viable, it could lead to faster build times, lower construction costs, better quality, durability, homes, and more environmentally friendly construction. Everything starts with an initial test. I think 3D printing has emerged more forcefully in other places in the world, but yet in Canada. And I think it's a prime, the whole building industry, labor code, I think is a prime opportunity for a little bit of disruption, particularly when you see that, the cost of a 2x4 has gone from $2 to $10 or $11 in the last year. Clearly there's something going on and there's an opportunity to explore other ways of building homes. This is just a small and exciting example of the work at CMHC we're doing. We're also making a point of getting out to meet with groups like this one, just have open conversations, connect with as many traditional and non-traditional players as possible. I hope it inspires folks to get involved. You can visit our website for more info on the National Housing Strategy. And even if you don't think your idea or project fits some of our programs, we are trying to move away from being uber program centric. There's always some element of that. We are a government agency after all. But maybe we can help make a connection that will help make your idea a reality. We've seen firsthand that partnerships or collaboration opportunities that we didn't necessarily see a path to fruition at the beginning, where they went. The housing initiatives I just mentioned were just all first for CMHC. Each was made possible not because they were innovative or really out there, but rather because we were just willing to think differently and try some things outside the norm, and most importantly, go after them. I'll end with a quick anecdote for me that sums up the incredible potential we all share. Before the pandemic, I had the opportunity to spend some time with colleagues in France exploring all things technology, artificial intelligence, blockchain, Internet of Things, quantum computing, tech for good. This was made possible through our work with Accenture, who's our IT partner. While there, I had the opportunity to spend time with a fellow named Edwin van der Ouderha, a senior managing director at Accenture in the area of digital and analytics. In discussing housing affordability with him, Edwin made two statements that have stuck with me. First, and I've referenced this already, there is a ton of capital in the world. Having enough capital to solve housing challenges is not the problem. Second point was human capacity is endless. Human beings are capable of amazing things, and so capacity should certainly not be viewed as a barrier to solving most things, and definitely not housing affordability. I've realized during my 2 years in this role that the untapped capacity and desire to contribute to our aspiration is jaw-dropping. We often think of the challenges of housing affordability as a problem of scarcity. In fact, I truly believe an abundance mindset is what will help us achieve our 2030 goal. It's not a question of having enough opportunities to pursue, but rather it's about identifying which opportunities have greatest potential and impact. Then what's holding us back? I really think it might be us. And if I'm right, let's not let that be the case anymore. Thanks, Alina.
Awesome. That's perfect. That's a really nice segue, especially because we're going to get into talking about one of the critical issues that we've seen really get amplified by the pandemic, which is homelessness. So the flip on capacity versus scarcity is much needed, and a very different way of thinking about things. Love it. Thank you. Thanks so much, Steff. So we're going to have Ian up next. And he's going to, like I said, be talking about homelessness and the Reaching Home strategy, in particular from his stance as you're the policy lead or research lead around data and some of the innovative programming and technology programs that are happening at Reaching Home. So lots of great content that's going to be in his piece, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So start thinking about questions as well. So without further ado, is that right? Okay, I'll hand it over to Ian.
Great, thanks, Alina. I hope you can hear me all right. Is that right? Perfect. Yeah. Great. So I think it will be a good segue building off of what Steff was saying, going from housing to homelessness. What I'm going to talk about today is data and innovation in the homelessness support sector. Before I get going, going back, looking at where everyone was coming from, I do want to give a shout out to those people joining us from Grand Prairie and from Hythe, which is right next to Grand Prairie. That's where I was born, and that's where my hometown is. But now I'm coming to you from Ottawa and ESDC. If you could change the slide, please. So given the title of today's talk, I thought it would be appropriate to start off with a few findings from social research and some stats about the state of homelessness in Canada, give us a little bit of context here. So looking at some of our national data sources, and in this case, the National Emergency Shelter Study, we estimate that there's about 129,000 individuals who use the shelter in 2016, including 27,000 of those who are considered chronically homeless, right? Moving on to the next slide. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on the data. The data is available. You can find the data on our website, and happy to point you in that direction if you're interested in these. But the point is really to go beyond what the data is telling us and kind of what the future brings for data and innovation in the homelessness sector. So a couple of other stats for you. So looking at the 2018 nationally coordinated point in time count of homelessness, which is important because it does shed light on some of those gaps in homelessness experienced outside of the shelter system, including reasons for housing loss. We see that the main reason for housing loss varies across different age groups. We see the importance of homelessness experienced before the age of 25, and also some interesting demographic stats about youth homelessness, for example, and that 21% of youth who were surveyed identified as LGBTQ2, which is something that doesn't come out in shelter data. And again, if you're interested in these, this information, these stats from the point in time counts or from the National Shelter Study, they are available on the ESDC website. And so taking together these two slides kind of give us a sense of where we are right now with data. And jumping to the next slide, you know, now let's kind of jump into the future, right? Like, well, I can't guarantee what that's going to look like. I can give you a sense of where the homelessness service sector seems to be going, at least based on a couple of observable trends in data and community service provision. So the first trend is related to integrated data systems. And so I kind of put together a generic definition here. So where individual level administrative data is shared across social sectors and levels of government, where this data is linked to inform policy and programs, and where it can be used to improve individual case management. And at the end of the day, better outcomes for individuals and those that we're trying to help. I think this relates really well to what Dale was saying earlier about what's new now around the access and transparency of data, which never existed before. So the data is available, I think, as Alina knows very well, through HelpSeeker. And it's about taking the data and incorporating it into an integrated data system. The whole concept and reason why integrated data is so important for the homelessness sector has to do with the complexity of the issue that we're trying to solve, right? For those of you who are here today who kind of work in the sector, I think you know very well that there's no single reason for homelessness, right? One way to think about it is to look at the homeless population and think of it as made up of many who have kind of slipped through the cracks of the mainstream social safety net, and what's left over are those who need to be housed. But their problem isn't just housing, it's also wraparound supports related to addiction, related to mental health, and many other problems as well. So as such, in order to really understand trajectories into homelessness, plan programs and allocate resources effectively to prevent and end and resolve the issue, it's necessary to really link the data from the various social sectors such as health, corrections, homelessness, housing, etc. The second trend is around coordinated access. So here, just kind of using the ESDC reaching home definition as an example, coordinated access can be understood as a process where those experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness are directed to community level access points where trained workers use a common assessment tool to evaluate individuals and families and their depth of need, and to prioritize them for housing support services and to match them to available housing intervention and services. So the positive outcomes associated with both of these trends are really based on collaboration, which has been, I think, a theme throughout all three presentations here, and joint community action to break down the silos that kind of exist across and within service providers and communities as well, and to make the most of the available resources, whether this is in data, for example, across the different social sectors, or in the housing services that are available. So while I'm quite optimistic about the role that data will have in helping to prevent, reduce, and end homelessness in Canada, there are a number of data challenges that we need to tackle as a sector. So going to the next slide, please. So I've kind of put some of the main challenges here, and these are not meant to be wholly exhaustive or necessarily mutually exclusive. They do interact with one another. I think it does give a good sense of data issues in the homelessness serving sector. So kind of under the heading of knowledge and data gaps, and Steff kind of hit on this too. Like, we know a lot about the sheltered homeless population through data collected through HIFIS, for example, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But we don't know nearly as much about those who don't use shelters, or those who don't touch the homelessness support sector, who don't touch the system, those who may be sleeping rough, staying in cars or motels, hotels, or couch surfing with friends or family. So as a result, not only do we have incomplete data about the homelessness experience and those individuals who are homeless, but we're lacking important information about populations that are less likely to use shelters in the first place. In particular, for example, women, youth, veterans, and those in rural and remote locations who may not even have access to a shelter in the first place. In addition to these challenges here around what we know, there are also a lot of challenges in kind of how we use homelessness data. And so here on the right, I just want to highlight some of the themes that have been talked about today, but also that we identified in kind of a survey of community data challenges with our community partners in the homelessness sector. So some of the feedback that we received and what we heard from respondents was around the lack of resources and capacity on the ground within service providers. And I think for those of you here who work in the sector, that will come as no surprise to you. Also around gaps in data literacy on the ground to effectively use the data that is available now. So some of the systems can be cumbersome, they can be quite technical and difficult to use. And also a lot of challenges in governance, in data sharing and accessibility within the sector, but also across social sectors as well. We know there's a lot of data around homelessness in the health sector, for example, but it's challenging to integrate the data coming from these other sectors with homelessness and housing data. And this kind of suggests that, you know, although I think we're on the right path, there's still more work to do when it comes to breaking down silos. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about Reaching Home, which is Canada's homelessness strategy and housed here at Employment and Social Development Canada. I won't go too deep into describing the program, but for those who may be unaware, Reaching Home is a community-based program aimed at preventing and reducing homelessness across the country. We provide funding to urban, Indigenous, rural, and remote communities to help address local homelessness needs. The program supports the goals of the National Housing Strategy, which Steff was talking about earlier today, in particular to support the most vulnerable Canadians in maintaining safe, stable, and affordable housing, and to reduce chronic homelessness nationally by 50% by 2028. There has been some language recently in the government's looking at eliminating chronic homelessness altogether across the country, which is an admirable goal. And we're working with our partners in communities and across the country to look at how we could make that a reality and what that would look like in terms of programming going forward. But, you know, more information about the program, the objectives and the guidelines are available on the ESDC website, or I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. But what I really want to talk about, I think in vein and in line with the topic of today's discussion, is about how Reaching Home is supporting innovation in homelessness data creation and implementation. So first of all, Reaching Home is promoting evidence-based collaboration in communities and through the implementation of coordinated access. So I kind of provided a definition earlier, but kind of under Reaching Home, communities that are receiving our funding are have a goal to introduce coordinated access across a homelessness support sector to help prioritize those who are in need of assistance and to match them with appropriate housing and services. In addition to that, we support development, maintenance, and implementation of the Homeless Individuals and Families Information System, or HIFIS, which some of you may be familiar with. So HIFIS is, for those who are not, HIFIS is a data collection and case management system that allows service providers across the community to access real-time data and to increase coordination of services. So HIFIS also supports daily operations and data collection for communities and for service providers as well. So essentially, HIFIS is a tool that communities can use to do coordinated access, right? So under Reaching Home, communities are encouraged and required to adopt HIFIS as their local homelessness information management system if they don't already have a comparable system in place. So at ESDC, we're also working with our partners, including other federal government departments like CMHC, other levels of government and communities to advance understanding of homelessness and help fill some of those knowledge and data gaps that we talked about a little bit earlier. So this includes, you know, not just through the nationally coordinated point in time counts and filling gaps about people who don't use shelters, but also creating new data and information sources about homelessness, such as collaborating again with CMHC and StatsCan to get questions about homelessness into national-wide surveys like the Canadian Housing Survey, like the General Social Survey. And moving forward, hopefully our goal, my goal maybe, is to get some of these questions into the 2026 census. So we have a few years to work on that, but it moves more quickly than you would think. And lastly, the timing of this, and so Alina, thanks for inviting me, is very good, because I do want to let people know that we are accepting applications for our community capacity and innovation funding stream, which is now open until June 11th. So more information about the process, eligibility requirements, and everything else can be found on the ESDC website. But my pitch for this program, in line with the topic today, is that it does support communities to implement coordinated access and projects that foster innovation in the homelessness serving sector. We're looking for projects that test and develop new innovative approaches to address homelessness in communities. And really, we're looking at 3 different priorities or themes. The first is to test or develop interventions targeted at specific populations, including, for example, Indigenous peoples, youth, seniors, LGBTQ2, women fleeing violence, veterans, or Black and racialized Canadians. The second is to develop strategic partnerships and contribute to enhanced community collaboration, to increase capacity building in the homelessness support sector, and to build connections with other levels of government, maybe integrated data systems. And the third is developing effective practices or techniques to measure the scope of homelessness or address data gaps, including hidden homelessness, which is a huge gap, as I mentioned earlier. So that's my pitch for this funding stream. It's open until June 11th, and more information is available on the ESDC website. Thank you very much.
Don't you love it when a presenter pitches you on their money? So that's great. So everybody, you can send your applications to Ian directly. He's more than willing to entertain them. Thanks, Ian. Awesome. And that kind of concludes the formal part. We do have a number of questions that are happening as well. But I'm actually, my team's telling me that to make sure I tell you before everybody jumps off to other things, what is on tap for our next webinar. So I'll make sure to do that. And if folks that were presenting can put their camera on while I do my spiel about what's happening next for HelpSeeker and what to look out for, then we'll get the questions answered. So May 26th, we've got a product launch that I think there's 400 folks that are coming to it. So I think our capacity on Zoom is 500. So if you're interested in taking a look at some of our new tech that is coming out and some of the pieces I referenced before, you're all obviously invited and would love to see you there. So May 26th, 9 a.m. Mountain Time. So that's 11 Eastern. And then for our upcoming webinar, and as you all know, June, there's National Indigenous Peoples Day on the 21st. Our webinar kind of lines up. June 17 is our next webinar. And this one is focused on putting Indigenous self-representation and data sovereignty and ownership in systems mapping as the focus. So we're going to have folks from our team and from some of the communities that we're working with. One of them is an interesting project on mapping support services and housing on reserve and off reserve, and that's with the AFN. So that is a project that we're so excited about because it's one where we're working with First Nations as a government, as a form of government. And that means that the way we do systems mapping is very different, and Indigenous sovereignty and OCAP principles apply even more so. So if those are things that are of interest to you, we're going to dig into supporting Indigenous self-representation in our practice and in what this means from a systems mapping perspective, but obviously much more general application as well. So I encourage you to join us for that. And then we're going to now open it up to some of your questions. So I'll do my best to look at some of these as groupings, and my team has been kind of keeping them up to date. Okay, so funny enough, there's a couple of them that are to do with concerns around digital literacy and whether the technology gap is going to negatively impact the social sector. So some of them are to me, and I feel like you guys have heard me talk about these before. I think I'll open it up to my co-presenters on this. Ultimately, to me, it's going to happen with or without the social sector. So it's up to us to mobilize and drive the change rather than catch up to it, would be my thinking, because I think it is already impacting things in a negative way. So the displacement of lower income workforces from some of these jobs through automation is going to be a big shift. And so, if we're not engaging with these trends, if we're not developing tech that's going to make our life easier so that we can change the way we do work in community, we're going to be left behind. So for sure, I think it's going to be a potential negative if we're not into it. But I want to open it up to co-presenters to see if they have an opinion on this as well, whoever wants to jump in.
I would agree with you, Alina. I think COVID has exposed that. COVID has also exposed a lot of opportunities that aren't going to go back to the way they were. So to your point, I think we all have to take it upon ourselves. And then there's also a point for large organizations to try to put some support and help the smaller ones get into this space. Because ultimately, when you think about it, success is going to be measured on how we kind of collectively attack some of these issues. It's not going to be measured on how one group did. It's going to be measured when we can, as I said, kind of like the game of Risk is where we use all of our armies, if you want to use a lack of better terms, to fight in the same direction. So we'll have a better chance of success. And if that's not data driven, I think we just get back to some of the issues that we're currently exposed to today.
Thanks, Chief. Anybody else want to take that one? All good.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of comments on that. I agree wholeheartedly. Like it is identified as a major gap and a risk on the ground. Oftentimes, like you touched upon this too, Alina, in your introduction about kind of one of the trends going forward and what to look out for, and that's kind of the simplifying the use of data, right, through data visualization, for example. Oftentimes the tools that are developed by experts who aren't using the tools on a day-to-day basis. And the more complex and difficult the tools that are being developed are, if you're frontline at a shelter and you have to deal with a complex system and you have a lineup of 200 people trying to get in and it's minus 40 in Edmonton in February, right? You're not going to spend the time to, 20 minutes per person. You want to get these people in so they don't suffer from the elements, right? So there is work that needs to happen. I think a lot of it comes down to, for the tools themselves, ensuring that they're developed in consultation and collaboration with people who are using the tools, and it's not just being developed by an IT branch somewhere in a company or a federal department, for example.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. There's a couple, I wanted to make sure we dig into one of the questions around how lived experience is integrated in decision making, especially for those of you that are in these decision maker roles. At HelpSeeker, we operate a little bit differently because we're tech, but we do certain things like user engagement. So for instance, in our work, to answer that question, we've chatted. We've had consultations with 2,000 people with lived experience in the last 2 years, for instance, to develop our tech solutions. So for us, if people don't find use in our stuff, we get fired. So it's kind of, we have a different relationship that way, because the customer of our technology if they don't like it, they don't use it, and therefore our numbers suck, and then we're not successful. But that's a very different working context than government would have, for instance, or even policing. So I don't know, Ian or Steff, maybe from your perspective, and then to Dale for his.
I'll start off with that. One of the major changes that accompanied the transition from homelessness partnering strategy to reaching home in 2019 was really providing an increase in flexibility to communities in how they wanted to spend their money to address homelessness needs, right? Recognizing that it's difficult for the federal government in Ottawa to tell Edmonton, Calgary, any other city kind of, what's best or where they should be putting the money that's being provided for homelessness. So I think, incorporating lived experience into the challenges that are, similar but also unique across communities in Canada is an important aspect for developing kind of the local solutions to help end homelessness at the end of the day.
Anyone else?
I think for us, we've got a commitment to action that we're looking for the input of the community all the time. I think we've had over 43 or 4,500 contacts, certainly a bunch of front-facing, even though front-facing today is on Zoom, and we've had some lunch and learns too. So I think this is an integral part in relation to that. And I think on the one that I spoke about earlier in relation to our accelerator is working with some of our vulnerable population, one of the projects to actually get their input to help build it is what they need. Because ultimately, if we can do that with them, obviously it's got more scale to it, it's relevant, and it also focuses on what is needed in the present time versus necessarily something that's going to take months or a year to get to. So we're doing that on a few different levels, and certainly we have a whole community engagement team as well as Community Safety and Wellbeing Bureau now that's very much focused on partner driven, which is basically outreach to the community with metrics to take patrol and investigative services out of business. So a pretty audacious goal, but at the end of the day, as said, and Steff said it as well, if we don't set big goals, then it's hard to get the first 20%.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thanks. There was one piece in the chat, one comment in the chat when you were presenting, Ian, about, and I thought it was like right on point, that it's not lost on them that some of the stats you were presenting were from 2016 and 2018, and it's now 2021. So when we talk about innovation and being responsive and agile and disruptive, how are we going to make sure that we're actually plugged into what's happening now, and our data infrastructure is real time as possible when we make these decisions, so we're not making decisions on old data. Any response to that?
Yeah, I do. I like that comment actually, so thanks for that. I forget you made it. But a couple of points to make there is it does depend on the type of data, right? Like when you're doing surveys are different than the real-time data required to potentially move someone into homelessness, right? Like looking at trends over time, surveys can be effective, like with respect to the nationally coordinated point in time count, which was the 2018 data that I was using. That's a survey that's conducted on about every 2 years, and it did launch in 2020, right before the pandemic hit. And so luckily we were able to roll out the survey in primarily British Columbia communities. However, due to health and safety concerns, not just for the surveyors and volunteers, but also for people experiencing homelessness, communities are provided with the flexibility to kind of extend that survey and data collection exercise into 2021, and given the second and third waves, also into 2022 as well. So the process still is ongoing, and it will reveal some more interesting and additional information about homelessness experience outside of the shelter system. But to answer another aspect or element of that question is around homelessness management information systems like HIFIS that's used in many communities and shelters across the country. And I know Alberta has their own homelessness management information system, and Toronto as well. But that data is real time, right? You are able to get that information real time to, you know, to see who's experiencing homelessness across your community, right? It's less important for us, the federal government, to have that information than it is for the communities who are dealing with the challenges to have the real-time information. So that's why we've made investments in technology platforms like HIPUS and encouraged communities to work on the collaboration and the governance to ensure that it's a coordinated community approach to identifying and supporting individuals with their homelessness challenges.
Awesome. So I'm going to make the call that, because it's now 10:32, but I do want to leave us with one question that I saw threads of, and I'm going to put it to Dale because I feel like he's going to have an interesting vantage point on this. The resistance to data sharing across organizations and across systems, and how we might get us all there to work differently together. And I think that's kind of one of the root causes of a lot of the challenges around service delivery being integrated, is we can't even share basic things. So any thoughts on, and anything you see on the horizon for innovative approaches to overcoming this lack of data integration, Dale?
No small question, hey, Alina.
No, food for thought.
What's interesting, I think in time, I think you've nailed it, and everybody's nailed it. In time, technology is going to solve this problem. You know, there's all kinds of things coming up in relation to synthetic data and everything. Technology will solve this problem, but in the interim, let's remember why privacy was designed. It was to share information, not to not share information. So in a lot of the instances that we're talking about when safety is at risk, there already is the ability to share information. I mean, if you look at it, I had this under my ministry in government. All the ministries have mechanisms to share. You know, obviously there has to be, as Lynn would tell you, through StatsCan, you get your right MOUs, you get your the perspectives that you need, and making sure that the protection of the individual is. And I mean, StatsCan is the gold standard for this. And they have dealt with this for a number of years. And I certainly learned a lot from that. I think the bigger issue between you and I, or between us and the group, is the people. Like, people just put this whole thing that we're not going to share it. So let's take the police. Well, that's police information. We're not going to share it. No, if somebody's well-being or safety is at risk, we damn well better be sharing it with people that can make a difference, whether it's a health professional. And so I think we get checks and balances through leadership to get us through that. But you also have to have the mechanisms and the ability to do it, and making sure that obviously you're doing it for the right reasons. But a lot of the data, and you're the living proof of this, a lot of the data that we need to change the system is public already. 90% of what we need is public. There's no magic to this. It's just a matter, like you've uncovered this. If we're going to do different things, the ability to do that now, it's when that safety piece gets in, there's mechanisms to share, and we need to leverage those mechanisms. And quite frankly, I've sat through many death inquests, certainly, you know, the MMIWG, you name it, certainly over the course of the years. All of these have said we need to share information better, yet nobody's actually doing it to the level it can be done. So that's usually whether it's a lawyer in the police service or health, not to throw any stones, because we're probably two of the ones that have kind of are the slowest to evolve in that space. Social services being another one. I think that's basically more about people, relationships, but to not to downscore, underplay the fact is put the legal agreements in place to give you the ability to do it. And sometimes it just takes leadership to actually ensure it gets done, because everything starts, well, we can't do this. I mean, I always use the analogy, my dad was a painter. Paint comes in cans, not cans, right? If you flip that on its head, we could have a lot of actual opportunity in this space. But in the meantime, let's focus on what we do have. The problem with data information sharing isn't just about not sharing. The fact is most of the organization's data is not in good enough shape to share. So there's two big things in relation to that. And I think you got to get the first one in order. then always, you know, I don't think there's a privacy commissioner in the country at some point that I haven't spoken to, some with a good amount of debate. But there's all kinds of precedent when it comes to safety. So I think we just gotta, sometimes we just gotta do it.
Thanks. And I saw that one of the thumbs up coming from Sabina. I think there is absolutely leadership and impetus to do things differently now. And now it seems like some of us in these leadership roles are pushing the envelope a little bit further, because some of it was a red herring myth type of stuff. And actually we can do a lot even within this current parameters. It's great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We're a little bit over time, but I think that was well worth our extra few minutes. So thank you to the presenters and your insights. We will see everybody again at the Indigenous Systems Mapping webinar happening in June. So definitely sign up for that if you haven't. And otherwise, stay well and stay safe. Thanks, everybody. And yes, everything recorded will be sent and the slides. That's
Thanks,
it.
folks.
Bye now.